The member for Fullerton South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me pleasure to rise and speak to Bill 13 and act to amend the Local Governance Act, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I drove the Chevy to the levy and opened the dictionary to read the definition of levy. And the definition of levy is the act of levying a tax. Interesting. This government said they weren't going to bring about any more taxes, but it's kind of cute the way they use the term levy, like it's used for the carbon levy. It's actually a carbon levy, and so this is a tourism levy. Well, that's nice that we're using this terminology and we all understand what it means, Mr. Speaker. I know municipalities are quite eager to have the ability to levy this hotel tax to generate revenue for tourism promotion. I've spoken to quite a number of mayors who are quite eager for this. And certainly as Greens, we're very supportive of increasing the local autonomy of our communities, both urban and rural. This does seem to provide much more benefit and ability in terms of creating more autonomy over tourism promotion in our urban areas, Mr. Speaker, leaving rural communities kind of out in the cold a little bit. And of course, you know, tourism occurs in both places, so it's not quite clear to me how we get equal opportunity in tourism with the ability of municipalities being able to tax their the guests in hotels, and then utilizing those funds, that revenue in some way to do tourism promotion for their area. So, Mr. Speaker, you think about areas like Carrickette or Grand Manan or or St. Stephen, Heartland, Tracadie. It's Rogersville. There's lots of places, Mr. Speaker, where there's wonderful, you know, locations to visit for tourism purposes. Deer Island, Campobello, Lemec, Île Mascou, the islands of New Brunswick, the Île de Nouveau-Brunswick, but the revenue will not necessarily be there to do the kind of tourism promotion that should happen just because of the you know, fewer accommodations, fewer hotels, the lower volume of people. So it raises a question of where's the equity here? And I guess the assumption was in the abstract, when this has been discussed for years and years and promoted by the tourism ministry and embraced by many municipal councils and mayors and advocated for, that the Department of Tourism would continue to invest in tourism promotion for the province, and so that no one would really be left out in the cold. But we see significant cuts in the Department of Tourism's budget, Mr. Speaker, and that is of concern for those areas that don't have significant numbers of hotels with large numbers of guests that will collect far more revenue than other areas of the province. So it does introduce this inequity without that backstop of the sort of regular budget that tourism has had in the last few years to do tourism promotion for the entire province. So that is a concern. So there would be less of a concern, of course, if the budget hadn't been cut, Mr. Speaker, at the Department of Tourism, but it has been. So I'm not sure, there'll be questions at committee, certainly from me, on how the minister sees he's going to be able to address this inequity that will likely result, because it does need to be addressed. That's for sure, and there's no, you know, walls between our cities and our rural communities, and our visitors will want to visit both. But we need to ensure that tourism is done well around the province. Tourism promotion is done well around the province, Mr. Speaker. There, of course, I've heard concerns from families whose children play sports, who are in hockey, who are in soccer, and you travel. You know, one of our daughters was in soccer, and we spent time in motels around the province, and that this is going to up those costs. Mr. Speaker, and that's an understandable concern for parents who spend a lot of time in motels were going with their children to hockey games and tournaments, or basketball, soccer, or gymnastics, many sports activities which requires travel and overnight stays around the province. And I assume this is why it's taken so long to get to this decision, because governments in the past have been concerned about the impact on those folks. I didn't hear the minister address that at all. He seems quite concerned about the impact of the carbon levy on families, even though it's all going to be refunded and more, where in this case there's no refund. So it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say about that during committee and when questions are asked about this. There are lots of issues around this, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the details of how this money ultimately will be managed, the decision-making process, what kind of accountability the municipality will have in place to ensure that that the utilization of these funds that it's collecting from hotels and motels and so on are applied effectively to effectively promote tourism in the area, how it's going to be done fairly so that some tourism businesses are not advantaged over others. So it's a bit of a complicated hornet's nest, in a way. So I'm looking forward to the committee stage to ask those kinds of questions to get to the basics of this. But I know certainly that many mayors and municipal councils will be pleased that this is in the works now, and if done correctly and well, in balance with a more robust budget down the road for our tourism department, it could produce good results. But we shall see, and I'll pursue detailed questions at committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.